The castle of Ellangowan was an old and massive structure, situated by the sea-shores in the southwestern part of Scotland. It has been for many years the dwelling place of a family named Bertram, each of whom had in succession borne the title of the Laird of Ellangowan. They had once been people of wealth and importance in the neighbourhood, but through the lack of prudence and other misfortunes they had one after another lost much of the greatness and prosperity which had belonged to them in better days. One of their number became at last so poor that he could no longer maintain the old family residence, so he contented himself with occupying a much smaller house, which he had himself built, from the windows of which he could still look out on the ancient abode of his forefathers, as it dwindled year by year to the condition of a neglected ruin. At the time that our story commences, one Godfrey Bertram was the Laird of Ellangowan, and the owner of the now diminished estates. He was a good-tempered, easy-going kind of man, and became in consequence very popular with all the poorer people of the district, and especially with the gipsies, a large number of whom were at all times to be found in the neighbourhood. His wife had brought him a little money when he married, and he and she continued to lead a quiet and not unhappy life in their new home. Amongst Mr. Bertram's most intimate companions in his retirement was one Abel Sampson, a tall and awkward-looking man, with a harsh voice and huge feet, who was known to the people around as the Dominie. He was a man who spoke but little, and generally used very long words when he did, but he had a kindly and good-natured heart. He was for a time the parish schoolmaster at the village of Kippletringan, which was close to Ellangowan, and was employed now and then as a kind of clerk by the laird. The village of Kippletringan was situated a little distance from the sea, and although the neighbourhood was dignified by the possession of a custom-house, the place was still the favourite haunt of a large body of desperate and determined smugglers, who, it was supposed, were assisted by many of the small shopkeepers of the locality in disposing of the contraband goods which were surreptitiously brought in from foreign parts. One cloudy November evening, a young traveller, Guy Mannering by name, just came from the University of Oxford, was making his way with difficulty over the wild and lonely moorland which extended for many miles on the outskirts of the village. He had lost the road to Kippletringan, whither he was bound, but was lucky enough to find a guide to conduct him there before he had gone completely astray, and late at night he arrived at Godfrey Bertram's house, where he was hospitably welcomed by the owner. Supper was got ready, a good bottle of wine was opened, and the laird and the Dominie and Guy Mannering were enjoying themselves comfortably, when the conversation was interrupted by the shrill voice of someone coming upstairs. "It's Meg Merrilies, the gipsy, as sure as I'm a sinner," said Mr. Bertram, and as the door opened, a tall woman, full 6 feet high, with weather-beaten features and hair as black as midnight, stepped into the room. Her appearance was altogether of so strange a kind that it made Mannering start. After some conversation with the laird, the gipsy woman informed him that she had come to tell the fortune of his little son, who was born that night, and asked to be told the exact hour of his birth. Now, Guy Mannering himself, amongst other accomplishments, possessed a knowledge of the stars, and on learning the time at which young Bertram was born, he went outside to study the heavens with a view to foretelling what the future of the child would be. The sky had become beautifully clear, for the rising wind had swept away the clouds with which it had been previously overcast, and the observer was enabled to note carefully the positions of the principal planets, from which he made out that 3 periods of the infant's life would be attended by great danger to him, namely, his 5th, his 10th, and his 21st year. On the morning following, Mannering strolled out towards the old castle, thinking to himself whether he should tell Mr. Bertram what he had learned from the stars respecting his young son's future life. The castle was merely a ruin at this time, and as he wandered amidst the gloomy remnants of the ancient structure, his attention was arrested by the voice of the gipsy whom he had seen the night before. He soon found an opening in one of the walls through which he could observe Meg Merrilies without himself being seen. She was sitting on a broken stone, in a strange wild dress, and engaged in spinning a thread drawn from wool of 3 different colors. She was at the same time half singing and half muttering a kind of charm, which seemed to have reference to the child which had been born the night before. And as she finished, Mannering heard her murmur something about the thread of life being 3 times broken and 3 times mended, and distinctly heard her say, "He will be a lucky lad if he lives through it." He was about to speak to the gipsy when he heard a hoarse voice calling to her in angry tones from outside, and in a moment after a man, who was apparently a sea captain, came into where Meg Merrilies was seated. He was short in height, but prodigiously muscular, strong and thick set, with a surly and savage scowl upon his unpleasant features. He spoke with a foreign accent, and upbraided the gipsy for keeping him waiting so long, ordering her with a curse to come and bless his ship before it set out on its voyage. While still addressing the gipsy, he caught sight of Guy Mannering, and was about to draw a weapon against him, when she told him that he was a friend of Mr. Bertram's. He then introduced himself to Mannering, and said his name was Derek Hatteraick, the captain of the vessel that was lying off the shore. Mannering wished him good day shortly after, and as he saw him embarking in a small boat, he was convinced, from his conversation and appearance, that the captain was a smuggler. On returning to the new house at Ellangowan, Mannering learned from Mr. Bertram that this Dirk Hatteraick was the terror of all the excise and custom house cruisers, with which he had many a fierce fight. Before Guy Mannering took his departure from Ellangowan, Mr. Bertram asked him the result of his studying the stars on the preceding night, and in reply was handed a paper by Mannering, which he was told he should keep in a sealed envelope for 5 whole years. When the visitor had gone, Mrs. Bertram, the mother of the baby boy, was very anxious to read the paper, for she was a superstitious lady, but after a struggle with her curiosity, she contented herself with making a small velvet bag, into which she sewed the paper, and the whole was then hung as a charm round the neck of her young child. Time rolled on, and when little Harry Bertram grew to be 4 years old, he was already a great favourite with Dominie Sampson, who had acted as his tutor and was his constant companion. But just about this time the Laird of Ellangowan was appointed one of the magistrates of the county, and shortly after his appointment he began, little by little, to become very unpopular with the gipsies, with whom he had before been such a favourite. He thought it his duty now to punish and exterminate all amongst them who were poachers and trespassers, and caused even the poor beggars at his door to be sent to the workhouse. One tribe of these gipsies, amongst whom Meg Merrilies was a kind of queen, had lived for a long time unmolested in a few huts in a glen upon the estate of Ellangowan, at a place called Derncleugh. It was a miserable and squalid village, but for all that Mr. Bertram was determined to evict them, and all their poor belongings. He was no doubt doing as the law directed him, but as far as concerned the inhabitants of Derncleugh, he was acting with great harshness, for Meg Merrilies had all along shown a strong affection for his boy, little Harry Bertram. The day of eviction came at length, and a large body of men, under the direction of Frank Kennedy, a custom-house officer, made their way to the miserable village, and on the gipsies refusing to leave peaceably, proceeded to unroof their cottages and pull down the wretched doors and windows. There was no resistance, and when the work was ended, the now homeless tribe gathered together the remnants of their property and set forth with sullen and revengeful thoughts to look for a new settlement. Mr. Bertram had been some distance from home on the day of the eviction, but on returning in the evening he met the troop of gipsies. Some of the men muttered angry remarks as he passed them on the road, but he thought it best to make no answer. Meg Merrilies had, however, lagged behind the rest, and was standing alone on a high bank above the road as the Laird went by. Her dress was even stranger than usual, and her black hair hung loose about her, while her dark eyes flashed angrily. She had a light sapling in her hand, and as the Laird looked up to where she stood, she said to him, "Ride your ways, Laird of Ellangowan, ride your ways, Godfrey Bertram. This day have ye quenched 7 smoking hearths. See if your own fire burn the blither for that. Ye have riven the roof off 7 cottar houses. Look if your own roof tree stand the faster. Ride your ways, Godfrey Bertram. Why do you glower after our folk for? There's 30 hearts there that would have spent their life-blood ere ye had scratched your finger. Yes, there's 30 yonder, from the old wife of 100 to the babe that was born last week, that ye have turned out of their houses to sleep with the black cock in the moors. Ride your ways, ye Llangowan. Our bairns are hanging at our weary backs. Look that your braw cradle at home be the fairer spread up. Not that I am wishing ill to little Harry, God forbid. So ride your way, for these are the last words ye'll ever hear Meg Merrilies speak, and this is the last twig that I'll ever cut in the bonny woods of Ellangowan." And having uttered this dark and threatening speech, she turned contemptuously from him to join her comrades in misfortune. Meanwhile the smugglers, under their captain, Dirk Hatteraick, had been carrying on their lawless trade as usual, and the Laird of Ellangowan was as determined to put them down as he had been to get rid of the gipsies. He was actively assisted in his endeavours against them by the same Frank Kennedy who had carried out the eviction of Meg Merrilies and her companions, and the smugglers had sworn to be revenged upon their enemy. On the day that young Harry Bertram was 5 years old, Dirk Hatteraick's ship was in the bay outside the village of Kippletringan. A sloop of war in the king's service was pursuing it in order to seize the smuggled goods which were on board, when Frank Kennedy, looking out, saw that Hatteraick was likely to escape, as he had got his vessel round a headland called Warwick Point, where it was concealed from the sloop unless someone went down to the point and made a signal to the pursuers. He accordingly mounted his horse and galloped off. On his way he happened to meet little Bertram, who was walking with the dominie, and as he had often promised to give the child a ride, he took him up on his nag and rode off towards the point. Shortly afterwards the discharges of several cannon were heard, and after an interval a still louder explosion, as of a vessel blown up. As evening came on, Mr. and Mrs. Bertram were expecting little Harry to come home, and as he did not return, became very uneasy about him. After waiting for him in anxiety for some time, the news came in that Kennedy's horse had come back riderless to its stable. All was now bustle at Ellangowan. The laird and his servants rushed away to the wood of Warwick, but they searched long and in vain for any trace of Kennedy or the boy. It was already growing dark when a shrill and piercing shout was heard from the seashore under the wood, and on hurrying to the place, Mr. Bertram was horrified to see the dead body of Frank Kennedy lying on the beach right under a high precipice of rocks. In his wild dismay and terror for his child, and remembering the words of Meg Merrilies, the laird hurried away to Derncleugh, hoping to get some news of him from any of the gipsies who might still be lingering round the place. He wandered amongst the ruins of the cottages, where he found no one, although he noticed the remains of a fire in one of the huts. After a little, one of his servants came running to him and told him to come home at once, that Mrs. Bertram was dying. Half stupefied, he went back, but only to find that his wife was dead, and that a little daughter had been born to him, and that his boy was gone. The sheriff of the county arrived next morning and opened an inquiry. The wood was again searched, with the result that traces of a struggle were found near the top of the cliff over the place where Kennedy's body was found lying. Footprints of men and of a small boy were seen here and there. Witnesses who were examined said that they had seen the smuggler ship grounding and taking fire, and finally blowing up with a great explosion, but no one could say what had become of its crew. The gipsies were suspected, and Meg Merrilies was arrested, but when questioned she denied that she had been at the place. They found, however, a cut upon her arm, and on removing the handkerchief with which she had bound it, it was found to be marked with the name of Harry Bertram. No further evidence could be procured of her guilt, and she was at length set free, under sentence of banishment from the county. For many years after this, Mr. Bertram continued to live a solitary and mournful life at Ellangowan. The poor dominie never ceased to blame himself for the loss of the boy, as Harry was in his charge on the day on which he had disappeared, but he still lived with the laird as before, and was chiefly employed in teaching Bertram's daughter, little Lucy, who was now growing up into a gentle and bonny girl. The laird had always been a bad man of business, and after his wife's death he got into the hands of a scheming and dishonest attorney named Glossin, who in the end craftily succeeded in making himself rich at the expense of his employer. The debts of the laird became at length so many that the property at Ellangowan had to be mortgaged, and things ultimately went so badly with the poor owner that the men to whom he owed so much money determined to insist on the estate being sold, together with the house and all the furniture. It was rumoured, too, amongst the country folk that Glossin was the man of all others who was most eager to turn the Bertrams out of their house, in order that he might buy the property himself and become the Laird of Ellangowan. Now the property in Ellangowan had been what is called settled in such a way that it could not be sold if Mr. Bertram had a son living. It was therefore likely to be disposed of very cheap, as no one knew for certain that young Bertram was dead, while if he should happen to be alive, there was still a chance of his coming back and claiming the estates. When Glossin the attorney found that there was no more to be got out of his client in the way of money, he commenced openly to show the wickedness of his bad and cruel nature, and the very sight of him became hateful to the unhappy Godfrey Bertram. And so things went on until Lucy Bertram was 17 years old, and her father had become a weak and poor old man, and then Glossin determined to play his last card. The estates of Ellangowan were advertised to be sold to the highest bidder, and a day was fixed for the auction. Before describing how the sale took place, it will be necessary to tell something of Guy Mannering, who, as will be remembered, had left Ellangowan shortly after the day that young Harry Bertram was born. He became a soldier, and having served for a long time in India, was appointed colonel of his regiment. His wife and daughter were with him there, and they had become very intimate with a young officer in the same regiment, called Van Beest Brown, who, it was supposed, had come from Holland, where he had previously been engaged in trade of some kind. Colonel Mannering, for some reason, never cared for Brown, but chiefly because he had foolishly listened to the dishonourable suggestions of a friend, who, for reasons of his own, had secretly poisoned his mind against the young officer. The dislike ripened after some time into an open quarrel, followed by a duel between the colonel and his subaltern, in which, after exchanging shots, Mannering believed he killed his adversary. Mrs. Mannering died shortly after, and the colonel and his daughter returned to England. Now it so happened that Colonel Mannering arrived at the village of Kippletringan a day or two before the time at which the sale of Ellangowan was to take place. He was much distressed at hearing the pitiable account that was given to him of his old friend Godfrey Bertram, and the idea at once occurred to him that he would buy the property himself, and by doing so help the laird. Accordingly, on the day of the auction, he made his way to Ellangowan House, where he was told on inquiry that the old laird was dangerously ill, and was to be found up at the ruined castle in company with his daughter. Thither Colonel Mannering went to look for him. He found old Bertram sitting in an easy chair on the slope beside the castle, with his feet wrapped in blankets, and beside him his daughter and the dominie, and a handsome young man whom he did not recognize, but who, he afterwards learned, was a gentleman called Charles Hazelwood, who was deeply in love with Miss Bertram. Mannering was much affected when the old laird failed to remember him, for he had not forgotten his hospitable kindness many years before, on the night when little Harry was born. While he was engaged in conversation with Miss Bertram and her companion, a voice was heard close by, which Lucy at once recognized as that of her father's enemy, Glossin, and she sent the dominie to keep him away. The sound of the voice had, however, also reached the old man's ears. He started up on hearing it, and turning toward Glossin, he addressed him in tones of passion and indignation. "Out of my sight, ye viper," he said, "ye frozen viper that I warmed till ye stung me. Are ye not afraid that the walls of my father's dwelling should fall and crush ye limb and bone? Were ye not friendless, houseless, penniless, when I took ye by the hand, And are ye not expelling me and that innocent girl, friendless, houseless, and penniless, from the house that has sheltered us and ours for 1,000 years?" A few moments after, the carriage was announced in which Lucy Bertram and her father were to leave their home. But it was no longer necessary. The old Laird of Ellangowan was so exhausted by his last effort of indignant anger, that when he sunk upon his chair, he expired almost without a struggle or a groan. The sale of the property was then postponed until after the funeral, and Colonel Mannering, having done what he could for Miss Bertram in her unhappy condition, left the neighbourhood with the intention of returning in time for the adjourned sale, for the purpose of buying the estate. The appointed hour for the auction at length arrived, but Colonel Mannering had not come back. No one had even received a letter from him, and in his absence, as there was no other bidder, the infamous Glossin was declared to be the lawful purchaser and a new Laird of Ellangowan. At 6 o'clock that night, a drunken post-boy reached the village with a letter from the colonel, containing instructions to buy the property. It had been delayed on its way, and was now no longer of any use. Poor Lucy Bertram now found herself an orphan, without house or home, but the kindness of some neighbours named Macmorland to some extent assuaged the misery of her position. They insisted on her coming to live with them, and Mr. Macmorland even offered the dominie a clerkship in his establishment, where he might still be near his lady pupil, to whom, in spite of his strange and awkward ways, he was devotedly attached for her father's sake. When Colonel Mannering, after the death of Mr. Bertram, left Ellangowan with the intention of coming back to buy the property, he travelled some distance, and after a while came to a post town where he expected some letters. He received one letter which displeased him very much, from a great friend of his who was living in the north of England, Mr. Mervyn by name, in whose care he had left his daughter Julia Mannering, when he was starting for Kippletringan. This letter informed him that Miss Mannering was being serenaded at night from the lake beside the house by some unknown stranger, who had, however, disappeared before the letter was written. On reading this intelligence, the colonel hastened at once to Mr. Mervyn's residence, having first sent off the instructions in reference to the purchase of Ellangowan estate, which, as already said, arrived too late. The lover who had been serenading Julia Mannering was in reality the same Van Beest Brown whom she had known in India, and with whom her father had fought the duel. Colonel Mannering had, however, no idea that Brown was still alive, and the daughter was afraid to tell her father that he was. Captain Brown, as he was now known, was a handsome and gallant young fellow, and having returned to England with his regiment, and being still deeply devoted to Miss Mannering, he had lost no time in making his way to where she was staying, in the house of Mr. Mervyn, her father's friend. When Mannering arrived at Mr. Mervyn's, he said very little about the information which had been the cause of his return, but he told his daughter that he had taken a place near Kippletringan called Woodbourne, where he meant to reside for some time. He also told her that she would have a pleasant companion in Lucy Bertram, the daughter of an old friend of his, who was going to stay with them in his new house. Accordingly, as soon as Woodbourne was made ready to receive them, the colonel and his daughter Julia took up their residence there, and Lucy Bertram became their guest. Another inmate of the new house was the dominie, for whom Colonel Mannering had a liking, and who, he knew, could not bear to be parted altogether from Miss Bertram, whose tutor he had been from her earliest days. When the poor half-cracked dominie heard that he was to be employed as Colonel Mannering's librarian, his joy knew no bounds, and on seeing the large number of old books which were committed to his charge, he became almost crazy with delight, and shouted his favourite word, "Prodigious," till the roof rung to his raptures. After a little time, Lucy Bertram and Miss Mannering became fast friends, but the latter was careful never to say anything to her new companion about her lover, Captain Brown. Now Brown, when he found that Julia Mannering had gone to Woodbourne, determined to follow her, with the purpose of resuming his addresses, and he accordingly set out on foot towards the north. It was a fine, clear, frosty winter's day when he found himself in the wilds of Cumberland on his way to his destination in Scotland. He had walked for some distance when he stopped at a small public house to procure refreshment. He here fell in with a farmer named Dandy Dinmont, a big rollicking fellow with an honest face and kindly ways, with whom he became friends in a very little time. There was another person, however, in the inn on whom Brown could not avoid repeatedly fixing his eyes, a tall witch-like woman. It was Meg Merrilies the gipsy, but time had grizzled her raven locks and added many wrinkles to her wild features. As he looked at her, he could not help saying to himself, "Have I dreamed of such a figure?" As he was asking himself the question, the gipsy suddenly made 2 strides towards him and seized his hand, at the same time saying to him, "In God's name, young man, tell me your name and whence you come." "My name is Brown, mother, and I come from the East Indies," he answered. On hearing his answer, she dropped his hand with a sigh and said, "It cannot be, then. It cannot be. But be what ye will, ye have a face and a tongue that puts me in mind of old times." As Brown took his departure on foot, the gipsy looked after him and muttered to herself, "I must see that lad again." The traveller had gone a considerable distance across the lonely moorland through which his road lay, when his little dog Wasp began to bark furiously at something in front of them. Brown quickened his pace and soon caught sight of the subject of the terrier's alarm. In a hollow a little below him was his late companion Dandy Dinmont, engaged with 2 other men in a desperate struggle. In a moment Brown, who was both strong and active, came to the rescue, and after a short fight the 2 would-be murderers of the farmer were flying for their lives across the heath, pursued by Wasp. Dinmont then took his friend upon his pony, and they succeeded after some time in reaching Charlie's Hope, the farmer's home, where they were welcomed by his wife and a large troop of children. The next few days were spent salmon spearing and hunting otters on the hills in the neighbourhood. One of the huntsmen, of whom there were a large number out, was a dark-featured man, resembling a gipsy in his appearance, and Brown noticed that whenever he approached him he endeavoured to hide his face. He could not remember, however, having ever seen the man before, but he learned on asking about him that he was a stranger in those parts, who had come from the southwest of Scotland, and that his name was Gabriel. Nothing further was known about him at Charlie's Hope. Brown's visit to Dandy Dinmont was now at an end, and he again took the road for Woodbourne, the residence of Julia Mannering. He had hired a chaise and horses, but had not gone far on the wild road to Kippletringan when night came on and the snow fell heavily, and shortly after, to make matters worse, the driver missed the way. When the horses were unable to proceed any further, Brown dismounted from the carriage in order to look for a house where he could ask the way, and as he wandered through the plantations which skirted the road, he saw a light in the distance amongst the trees. After traversing a deep and dangerous glen, he reached the house from which the light shone. It was an old and ruinous building. Before approaching the door, he peeped in through an aperture in the ruined wall, and saw in the room inside the figure of a man stretched on a straw bed with a blanket thrown over it. He could see that the man was dying. A woman clad in a long cloak was sitting by the bedside and moistening at times the lips of the man with some liquid. She was singing a low, monotonous strain. She paused in her singing, and Brown heard a few deep groans come from the dying man. "It will not be," she muttered to herself. "He cannot pass away with that on his mind. I must open the door." Brown stood before her as she opened the door, and he at once recognized the same gipsy woman whom he had met in the inn a few days before. He noticed, too, that there was a roll of linen about the dying man's head, which was deeply stained with blood. "Wretched woman, who has done this?" exclaimed Brown. And the gipsy answered, "They that were permitted," and she added after a few moments, "He's dead now." Sounds of voices at a distance were now heard. "They are coming," said she to Brown. "You are a dead man." He was about to rush out when the gipsy seized him with a strong grasp. "Here," she said, "here, be still, and you are safe. Stir not, whatever you see or hear, and nothing shall befall you." She made him lie down among a parcel of straw, and covered him carefully, and then resumed her song. Brown, though a soldier and a brave one, was terrified as he lay in his hiding place. Peeping out through the straw, he saw 5 rough-looking men come in, who seemed to be gipsies and sailors. They closed round the fire and commenced to drink, holding consultation together in a strange gibberish which he could not altogether understand. Whenever the gipsy woman addressed them, she spoke angrily to them, and more than once she called them murderers. They, however, did not seem to mind her. They continued drinking and talking for a considerable time, but all that Brown could make out was that there was someone whom they were going to murder. They also referred to a murder committed some 20 years before, in which their dead companion had had a hand. After some time spent in this way, one of the party went out and brought in a portmanteau, which Brown at once recognized as the one he left in the chaise. They ripped it open, and after examining the contents, which included all the owner's ready money, with the exception of a trifling sum in his pocket, they divided the whole amongst them. Then they drank more, and it was not until morning that they left the building. When they left, they carried the dead body with them. No sooner were they well outside than Meg Merrilies got up from where she had been pretending to be asleep, and told Brown to follow her instantly. Brown obeyed with alacrity, feeling that he was already out of reach of danger when the villains had gone out. But before leaving, he took up a cutlass belonging to one of the 5, and brought it with him in the belief that he might yet have to fight with them for his life. The snow lay on the ground as he and the gipsy came out, and as he followed her, he noticed that she chose the track the men had taken, so that her footprints might not be seen. After a while, however, she turned from the track and led the way up a steep and rugged path under the snow-laden trees, and on reaching a place some distance farther on, she pointed out the direction of Kippletringan, and told her companion to make what speed he could. Brown was entirely at a loss to make out the reason the gipsy had for taking such an interest in preserving his life from her comrades, and was even more puzzled by her conduct when she took an old purse from her pocket before parting and gave it to him. She said as she handed it to him, "Many's the alms your house has given Meg and hers," and Brown, as he thanked her for her kindness, asked her how he could repay the money she had given him. "I have 2 boons to crave," answered the gipsy, speaking low and hastily. "One is that you will never speak of what you have seen this night. The other, when I next call for you, be it in church or market, at wedding or at burial, meal time or fasting, that ye leave everything else and come with me." "That will do you little good, mother," answered Brown. "But 'twill do yourself much good," replied Meg Merrilies. "I know what I am asking, and I know it has been the will of God to preserve you in strange dangers, and that I shall be the means to set you in your father's seat again. So give your promise, and mind that you owe your life to me this blessed night." When Brown had promised, she parted from him, and was soon out of sight. The young soldier could come to no other conclusion but that the woman was mad, and having in this way solved the mystery to his own satisfaction, he strode quickly on through the wood in search of the high road to Kippletringan. He reached the village at length, and engaged a room at the Gordon Arms, a comfortable inn kept by a Mrs. McCandlish. On opening the purse which the gipsy had given him, he was astonished to find that it contained money and jewels worth about £100. He accordingly entrusted it to the landlady of the inn for safe keeping. The day after his arrival at the village of Kippletringan, he determined to see Miss Mannering, and learning that she was likely to be found with a party of skaters on a lake in the neighbourhood, he proceeded in that direction. The skating party, of whom Julia Mannering was one, consisted of herself and Lucy Bertram, and young Charles Hazlewood, who, as before mentioned, was Miss Bertram's lover. Having spent some time upon the ice, they were returning to Woodbourne through the plantation. Hazlewood, who had a gun with him, had offered his arm to Miss Mannering, who was tired after skating, as they walked towards home. When they had proceeded some little distance in this way, Brown happened to meet them. He was wearing the rough suit in which he had spent the night in the gipsy's house, having been unable to procure a change on account of his portmanteau having been stolen. Julia Mannering, who had had no intimation that her old lover was in the district, uttered a scream when she suddenly saw him standing before her, and Hazlewood, fancying from the rough appearance of the stranger that he was either a gipsy or a tramp, pointed his gun towards him and ordered him to keep off. Brown, in a fit of jealousy and fearing that the gun might go off, rushed upon Hazlewood and seized the fowling piece. But in the struggle which ensued between them, it was discharged by accident, and young Hazlewood fell to the ground, wounded in the shoulder. Brown, when he saw what had occurred, became frightened at the thought of the dangers of his position. He bounded over a hedge which divided the footpath from the plantation, and was not heard of again for a considerable time. On the news of Hazlewood's being wounded getting abroad, the neighbourhood was thrown into a ferment of indignation. All the circumstances of the occurrence were exaggerated. It was universally believed that the attacking party was a smuggler or a gipsy, and that he had attempted in broad daylight to murder the young man. It was stated that the assailant had been seen earlier in the day wearing a smuggler's cutlass, and the purse which had been left at the inn was opened and found to contain property which had been previously stolen. Charles Hazlewood himself, however, continued to protest that the wounding was accidental, while the only person who could give any real account of the mysterious stranger, namely Julia Mannering, for reasons best known to herself, never pretended that she had any idea who he was. Amongst those who were most active in their endeavours to capture the missing Brown was Glosson, the new Laird of Ellangowan. It was plain, too, that he had some other motive for apprehending him than merely the desire to do his duty as a magistrate of the county, which he had now become. On returning to his house one day, he was informed that MacGuffick, the thief-taker, had made a prisoner, and that he was waiting with him in the kitchen. When the prisoner was introduced to the magistrate's room, Glosson at once recognized that it was Dirk Hatteraick, the smuggler captain. In the interview which took place between them, no one else being present, it transpired that Glosson had been a kind of partner with the smuggler at the time of Kennedy's murder and the disappearance of young Harry Bertram. Dirk Hatteraick told him, too, very plainly, that if he was to be condemned, he would let the secret out and ruin Glosson. Glosson, who was much terrified at the thought of being discovered, then arranged, like a villain that he was, to imprison Hatteraick for that night in a room in the old castle of Ellangowan, and at the same time give him a small file with which he might rid himself of his handcuffs and escape. During the interview between them, Hatteraick also told the attorney that young Bertram was still alive and at Kippletringan. Glosson's situation was therefore perilous in the extreme, for the schemes of a life of villainy seemed at once to be crumbling around and about him. Hatteraick was accordingly then sent to his place of confinement in the old castle. At midnight Glosson looked out from his bedroom towards the castle, and after watching for some time in an agony of guilty suspense, he saw the dark form of a man, whom he knew to be Hatteraick, drop from the prison window and make his way to the beach, where he succeeded in shoving out a boat which was lying there. In a few minutes after, he had hoisted the sail and soon disappeared round the point of Warwick. Great was the alarm and confusion the next morning when it was discovered that the smuggler had escaped from prison. Constables were sent in every direction to search for him, and Glosson took care to send them to places where they would be least likely to find him. In the meantime, he himself made his way to a cave by the seashore near the point of Warwick, where he had arranged with Hatteraick to meet him the day after his escape. Glosson had never been near this spot since the day on which the unfortunate Kennedy was murdered, and the terrible scene came back to his mind with all its accompaniments of horror as he stealthily approached the cavern. When he reached it and went in, he found Hatteraick in the dark and shivering with cold. During the conversation that ensued between them, he learned from the smuggler what had become of young Bertram after Kennedy's murder. He had been taken to Holland, Hatteraick said, and left with an old merchant named Van Beest Brown, who took a fancy to the boy and called him by his own name. He had afterwards been sent to India, but the smuggler knew nothing of him from the time he went there. Bertram had, however, been seen, he said, a few days before, among the hills by a gypsy named Gabriel. Glosson then discovered for the first time that it was young Bertram, in reality, who had wounded Hazelwood. In his terror at the thought of losing his property at Ellangowan, if it came to be known that Harry Bertram was alive, yet at all times fertile in every kind of villainous device, Glosson now hit upon a new plan to get rid of the man who stood between him and his peace of mind. By making large promises to Hatteraick, he induced the smuggler to agree to come by night, with a large body of his men, to the prison where Bertram would be confined for his attack on Hazelwood, and to break open the doors and carry him off. He said he would have the soldiers withdrawn on some pretence or other, so as to make the rescue more certain. And having completed the details of this desperate and lawless piece of villainy, he went back to Ellangowan. But it is time to return to Brown, who was now a fugitive from justice in consequence of the unlucky accident of which his rashness had been the cause. He determined to make his way to England, and to wait there until he received letters from friends in his regiment establishing his identity, in possession of which he could again show himself at Kippletringan, and offer to young Hazelwood any explanation or satisfaction that he might require. He accordingly took ship for Cumberland. He chanced on board to meet a man whose daughter was at the time in Colonel Mannering's service at Woodbourne, and by his means contrived to get a letter delivered to Miss Mannering, in which he begged of her to forgive him for his rash conduct towards Hazelwood. Having landed on the English coast, he wrote to the colonel of his regiment for such testimony of his rank in the army as should place his character as a gentleman and an officer beyond question. And, as he was now reduced to great straits for want of funds, he wrote to his sturdy farmer friend, Dandy Dinmont, for the loan of a little money. After a delay of some days, he received a short letter from Miss Mannering, in which she upbraided him for his thoughtless conduct and bade him good-bye, telling him on no account to come back to Woodbourne. On reading it over, he came somehow to the conclusion that Miss Mannering meant the opposite of all that she had written, and in this belief he set sail at once for Kippletringan. After a rough and dangerous voyage by night, he found himself in the morning off the Scottish coast. The weather had now cleared. A woody cape that stretched into the sea lay some little distance from the vessel, and in answer to Brown's inquiries, the boatman told him that it was Warwick Point. Close beside it was the old castle of Ellangowan, and Brown felt a strange longing, as he looked at it, to be put ashore for the purpose of examining it more closely. The boatman readily acceded to his wishes, and landed him on the beach beneath the ruins. And thus, in complete ignorance of his own real identity, surrounded by dangers, and without the assistance of a friend within the circle of several hundred miles, accused of a heavy crime, and almost penniless, did the weary wanderer, for the first time after an interval of many eventful years, approach the remains of the castle where his ancestors had once dwelt in lordly splendor. It will have dawned upon the reader before now that the young soldier, known to him as Brown, was in reality no other than the Harry Bertram who had disappeared on the day when Kennedy was murdered. The name of Brown will consequently be dropped during the remainder of the story, and our hero will be called by his proper appellation, Bertram. After wandering for some time through the ruined apartments of the castle, he stepped outside, and happened by chance to stand on the very spot where his father, the old Laird of Ellangowan, had died. Glosson, at that moment, chanced to be engaged close by with a surveyor in reference to some building plans connected with an intended addition to his house, and he was just saying to his companion that the whole ruin should be pulled down, when Bertram met him and said, "Would you destroy this fine old castle, sir?" His face, person, and voice were so exactly like those of his father when alive, that Glosson almost believed that the grave had given up its dead. But after a time he recovered his self-possession, and then set himself to discover if Bertram, whom he recognized, had any knowledge of his own identity. He was much terrified when he heard him repeat some lines of an old song, which he said he had learnt in his childhood. "The dark shall be light, and the wrong made right, when Bertram's right and Bertram's might shall meet on." But although he could not recall the end of the last line, Glosson thought he knew already a good deal too much about it. A few of Glosson's men were now seen approaching up the slope, whereupon he immediately assumed a different attitude and tone toward Bertram. "I believe your name is Brown, sir," said Glosson. "And what of that, sir?" replied Bertram. "Why, in that case," said Glosson, "you are my prisoner in the king's name." After a slight resistance, the prisoner was secured, and shortly after was brought before Sir Robert Hazelwood, one of the county's magistrates, and accused of maliciously wounding Charles Hazelwood, his son. In reply to the questions put to him, the prisoner said that he was a captain in the regiment of horse in his Majesty's service, and in a frank, manly way described how the wounding of Charles Hazelwood was merely an accident, for which he expressed a sincere sorrow. When required to give some proof of his rank in the army, he stated that his luggage had been stolen. When asked to say where he had spent the night on which it was taken, his promise to Meg Merrilies came to his mind, and he replied that he must refuse to answer that question. He was then pressed to account for his having worn a smuggler's cutlass, but he also declined to explain that matter, and his answers were equally unsatisfactory when questioned on the subject of the purse which the gipsy had given him. Having failed to give any explanation of so many suspicious circumstances, the warrant for his committal to jail was made out, although he stated that Colonel Mannering, whom he had known in India, could, if sent for, give evidence of his character and rank. The colonel was, however, away from home at the time, and the friendless and unfortunate Bertram was removed to prison, pending Mannering's return. "And now," said Glosson to himself, "to find Derek Hatteraick and his people, to get the guard sent off, and then for the grand cast of the dice." And so saying, he hastened away to complete with the smuggler captain the villainous plan on which they had previously agreed. The prison in which Bertram now found himself was a building which adjoined the custom house, and both were close beside the sea. MacGuffick, who had been already mentioned, was at the time the keeper, and a gruff and surly custodian he was too. Bertram, however, succeeded in procuring from him the luxury of a separate room by promising the keeper a large sum of money. He was accordingly ushered into a small, ill-furnished apartment, through the barred windows of which he could get a glimpse of the sea, which was dashing sullenly against the outer walls. As he was reflecting on his miserable situation, his attention was attracted by a loud knocking at the gate of the jail, and shortly after, his little dog Wasp, which he had left in the care of Dandy Dinmont, and Dinmont himself, was shown into his room. Bertram was delighted to have his old friend with him, and in answer to his eager inquiries as to how he came to be in prison, told him about the accident to young Hazelwood, and that he had been mistaken for a smuggler. Dinmont, on his part, then related how he came to know of Bertram's being locked up. Gabriel, the huntsman on the moors, he said, had informed him in a mysterious way that Bertram was in jail, and that he was badly in need of a good friend to stay with him night and day for a day or two. Dinmont added that he had ridden 60 miles that day to come to his assistance. They were interrupted in their conversation by MacGuffick, who told them that it was time for the visitor to leave, and by means of further promises he was induced to allow Dinmont to spend the night in the same room with his friend, and in no long time after, the two occupants of the wretched apartment were fast asleep. Colonel Mannering, who had been from home for some days, returned to Woodbourne the night of the day on which Bertram had been sent to prison. The morning after his arrival, the dominie, who even after so many years continued to blame himself for the loss of little Harry, made his way in a spirit of curiosity to Warwick Point, a place he had never approached since the child had disappeared. As he wandered home again, filled with gloomy recollections of the day of Kennedy's murder, his steps bore him to the neighbourhood of Derncleugh, with its ruined remains of the old gipsy village. The place had for many years had the reputation of being haunted, more especially the tower or came of Derncleugh. As he was passing by it, the door suddenly opened, and Meg Merrilies stepped out and stood before him. The dominie, believing she was some sorceress, addressed her in Latin. But the gipsy queen angrily interrupted him. "Listen, ye fool, to what I tell ye," she said, "or ye'll rue it while there's a limb of ye hangs together. Tell Colonel Mannering that I know he's seeking me. He knows, and I know, that the blood will be wiped out and the lost will be found. And Bertram's right and Bertram's might shall meet on Ellangowan height. Give him this letter, don't fail, and tell him the time's coming now. Bid him to look at the stars as he looked at them before, and to do what I desire him in the letter." She then led the frightened dominie by a short cut through the woods for about a quarter of a mile, and on reaching the common told him to stand still. "Look," she said, "how the setting sun breaks through the cloud that's been darkening the sky all day. See the stream of light that falls on the old tower of Ellangowan. That's not for nothing. Here I stood," she went on, stretching out her long sinewy arm and clenched hand, "here I stood when I told the last laird of Ellangowan what was coming on his house, and did that fall to the ground? And here I stand again to bid God prosper the just heir of Ellangowan that will soon be brought to his own. I'll no live to see it, maybe, but there will be many a blithe eye see it, though mine be closed. And now, Abel Sampson, as ever ye loved the house of Ellangowan, away with my message to the English colonel, as if life and death were upon your haste." So saying, she turned suddenly from the amazed dominie, who hurried back to Woodbourne, exclaiming as he went, "Prodigious! Prodigious! Prodigious!" The kindly interest of Meg Merrilies in the fate of Bertram did not, however, end here. Shortly after quitting the dominie, she met young Hazelwood on the road, and told him in a mysterious way that the guard of soldiers had been drawn off from the custom house and brought to his father's house in the expectation of an attack being made upon it that night. "Nobody means to touch his house," she added, "so send the horsemen back to their post quietly. They will have to work to-night. The guns will flash and the swords will glitter in the moonlight." She then asked him if he bore any malice to the man that wounded him, and on Hazelhurst assuring her that he had always thought it was an accident, she said, "Then do what I bid ye, for if he was left to his ill-wishers, he would be a bloody corpse ere morn." And she then disappeared into the wood. Charles Hazelwood, who now felt certain that some diabolical plot was on foot for the murder of the man who had accidentally wounded him, rode back at once to his father's house. He found the place occupied with dragoons, and instantly endeavored to persuade his father to send them back to the custom house. Glossin had, however, impressed the old man with a fixed idea of impending danger to his house, and he refused to allow the soldiers to go. While his son was still arguing with him, the sheriff of the county came in hurriedly and told him that he had information that the removal of the troops from the custom house was only part of a plan, and that they should at once return. Orders were accordingly given without delay, and the dragoons were shortly after on their way again to the place from which they came. But we must return to Bertram and his companion in their unpleasant abode in the prison. Towards midnight Bertram woke after his first sleep. The air of the small apartment had become close and confined, and he got up for the purpose, if possible, of opening the window. His failure to open it reminded him painfully that he was now a prisoner. He was no longer inclined to sleep, so he continued for some time to gaze out on the troubled sea, as it rolled under the indistinct light of a hazy and often overclouded moon. As he looked, he fancied he saw in the distance a boat being rowed toward the shore, and before long he found that he had not been mistaken. The boat, which was a large one, drew nearer and nearer, and as it reached the land, some 20 men jumped on shore and disappeared up a dark passage which divided the prison from the custom house. Almost immediately after, Bertram could hear a tumult in the outer yard of the Bridewell, and being unable to guess what its meaning was, he awoke Dinmont. The smell of fire now commenced to reach the room, and on Dinmont looking out of the window, he exclaimed, "Lord's sake, captain, come here! They have broken in the custom house." Looking from the prison window, they could see the gang of smugglers hurrying here and there, some with lighted torches, others carrying barrels toward the shore. It was plain, too, from the thick clouds of smoke that rolled past the window, that the prison was itself on fire. Dinmont roared loudly for MacGuffig to let them out, but all was silent in the jail. Outside, the shouts of the smugglers and the mob resounded far and wide, and it seemed as if the keeper had himself escaped and left his prisoners to perish in the flames. But now a new and fierce attack was heard at the outer gate. It was soon forced in with sledge-hammers and crows, and before long some 3 or 4 of the principal smugglers hurried to the apartment of Bertram with lighted torches and armed with cutlasses and pistols. 2 of them seized on Bertram, but one of them whispered in his ear, "Make no resistance till you're outside." They dragged him roughly to the gate, but amid the riot and confusion which prevailed, the sound as of a body of horse advancing was heard. A few moments after, the dragoons were engaged with the rioters. Shots were fired, and the glittering broadswords of the soldiers began to flash in the air. "Now," whispered the man at Bertram's left, "shake off that fellow and follow me." Bertram, with a violent and sudden effort, burst away from the man on his right, and closely following his mysterious friend, attended by the faithful Dinmont, who never left him, ran quickly down a narrow lane which led from the main street. No pursuit took place, as the smugglers had enough to do to defend themselves against the dragoons. At the end of the lane there was a post chaise and horses waiting. "Are you here in God's name?" said the guide to the driver. "Ay, troth I am," said he. "Open the carriage, then. You gentlemen get into it. In a short time you'll be in a place of safety, and remember your promise to the gipsy wife." Bertram and Dinmont got in at once, followed by little Wasp, and in a moment found themselves travelling at a breakneck pace, neither of them knowing where on earth they were going to. They were, in fact, on the way to Woodbourne, for the carriage had been sent by Colonel Mannering, after he had read the letter which the dominie brought him from Meg Merrilies. The note had given him no intimation, however, of the persons who were to be conveyed in the chaise to Woodbourne, merely telling him that it should bring the folk that should ask if it were there in God's name. As the colonel's clock was striking 1 that night, the sound of carriage wheels was heard in the distance, and in no long space after, Bertram and Dinmont found themselves at Woodbourne. Bewilderment and astonishment were depicted on the faces of all as Bertram stepped into the parlour. The colonel saw before him the man whom he supposed he had killed in India. Julia beheld her lover, and Lucy Bertram at once recognized the person who had fired upon young Hazelwood. Each one remained silent, not knowing what to say, when the absent-minded dominie, looking up from a book he had been studying in a corner, exclaimed, "If the grave can give up the dead, that is my dear and honoured master." A lawyer friend of the colonel's, a Mr. Pleydall, was staying at the Woodbourne that night, and he at once set about endeavouring to solve the mystery. He questioned Bertram as to his recollections of childhood, and elicited from him some of the incidents of his early life, with which the reader is already acquainted. Amongst the persons whom Bertram recalled, there was, he said, a tall, thin, kind-tempered man, who used to teach me my letters and walk with me. On hearing this, the poor dominie could contain his feelings no longer, and rising hastily from his chair, with clasped hands, trembling limbs, and streaming eyes, he called out aloud, "Harry Bertram, look at me! Was I not the man?" "Yes," said Bertram, starting from his seat, as if a sudden light had burst in upon his mind. "Yes, that was my very name, and that is the voice and the figure of my kind old master." The following day, Colonel Mannering and Mr. Pleydall succeeded in getting Sir Robert Hazelwood to accept bail for Bertram. While they were so engaged, Bertram, with his newly found sister and Miss Mannering, went walking to the castle of Ellangowan. Close by the ruin, they were suddenly confronted by Meg Merrilies, who addressed Bertram, saying, "Remember your promise, and follow me." It was in vain that his sister and her companion urged him not to go with the gipsy. He told them that he must obey. Then, bidding them good-bye, he started to follow Meg Merrilies, accompanied by Dinmont, who had come up a few minutes before. With quick, long strides, the gipsy proceeded straight across the wintry heath. She turned neither to the left nor to the right, and moved more like a ghost than a human being. On reaching the wood, she plunged into it, moving still rapidly in the direction of Derncleugh. After travelling thus for some time, she came at length to the ruined tower where Bertram had previously spent the night in concealment from the smugglers. Producing a key from her pocket, the gipsy opened the door and led the way in. She offered Bertram and Dinmont food and drink, and fearing to offend her, they took a little. "And now," she said, "ye must have arms, but use them not rashly. Take captive, but save life. Let the law have its own. He must speak ere he die." She then supplied the two with loaded pistols, and started afresh through the wood in the direction of Warwick Point. She led them by a long and winding passage, almost overgrown with brushwood, until they suddenly found themselves by the seashore. They were soon outside the secret cave. "Follow me as I creep in," she said. "I have placed the firewood so as to screen you. Bide behind it for a space, till I say, 'The hour and the man are both come.' Then run in on him, take his arms, and bind him tight." And having said so, she crept in upon her hands and knees, followed by Bertram and his friend. As they were creeping in, Dinmont, who was the last of the party, felt his leg caught by someone from behind. He with difficulty suppressed a shout, and was much relieved when he heard a voice behind him say, "Be still, I am a friend, Charles Hazelwood." He had been sent after the others by Lucy Bertram and Miss Mannering, and had only overtaken them as they were making their way into the cavern. Meg Merrilies, on reaching the interior, was greeted by Dirck Hatteraick with a curse in his old fashion. The smuggler had been expecting her, and was waiting with anxiety for news of his band. The only light within the cave was from a charcoal fire, the dark red glow from which gave a dismal and unearthly appearance to the smuggler's hiding place. Bertram and his friends had advanced far enough to enable them to stand upright, and concealed from the view of Hatteraick, they listened to his conversation with the gipsy. "Have you seen Glossin?" he said to her. "No," replied Meg Merrilies. "You've missed your blow, ye blood spiller, and ye have nothing to expect from the tempter." "What am I to do, then?" said the smuggler, with a Dutch oath. "Do?" answered the gipsy. "Die like a man, or be hanged like a dog. Didn't I tell ye, when ye took away the boy Harry Bertram, in spite of my prayers, that he would come back again in his 21st year? You'll never need to leave this." "What makes you say that?" asked Hatteraick. And Meg, who now threw some flax upon the fire, which rose in a bright flame, answered, "Because the hour and the man are both come." At the appointed signal, Bertram and his companions rushed upon Hatteraick. The ruffian, who instantly saw he was betrayed, turned his first vengeance on Meg Merrilies, at whom he discharged a pistol. She fell with a piercing shriek, muttering, "I knew it would be this way." A terrific struggle ensued between the smuggler and his assailants, in which Hatteraick contrived to discharge a second bullet at Bertram, which only missed its mark by a lucky accident. Strong, however, as the ruffian was, he was not equal to the joint efforts of the three men, and at length he was fairly mastered, disarmed, and tightly bound. Hazelwood, whose horse was outside the cave, then rode off for assistance, and after some time returned with several others. The prisoner was carried out, still firmly bound, and also Meg Merrilies, who was still living, though desperately wounded in the chest. They wished to take her to the nearest cottage, but she refused to be moved anywhere but to the Kaim of Derncleugh. Accordingly they bore her to the vault in the ruined tower. The alarm had now spread through the countryside that Kennedy's murderer had been taken on the very spot where the murder had been committed years before, and a crowd of people, with a clergyman and a surgeon, had flocked to the place where the dying gipsy lay. She, however, refused all offers of assistance, and called for Harry Bertram. When Bertram approached the wretched bed on which she lay, she took his hand. "Look at him," she said to those about her, "the image of his dead father. And hear me now. Let that man," pointing to Hatteraick, "deny what I say if he can." And then she told the story of how the young boy had been carried off from Warwick Wood, how she saved his life from smugglers who would have murdered him, and how she swore an oath to keep the secret till he was 21, and vowed that if she lived to see the day of his return, she would set him again in his father's seat, though every step was on a dead man. "Dirck Hatteraick," she said, "you and I will never meet again until we are before the judgment seat. Will ye dare deny it?" And as Hatteraick refused to open his lips, she added, "Farewell, and God forgive you." your hand has sealed my evidence." And shortly after, as she heard the crowd about her greet Bertram with enthusiastic cheers as the true Laird of Ellangowan, her troubled spirit passed peacefully away. The following day Hatteraick was brought before the magistrates at Kippletringan. The dying declaration of Meg Merrilies was proved by the surgeon and the clergyman who had heard it. Bertram again told his recollections of early childhood. Gabriel, the gypsy, the same man who had avoided meeting Bertram's eye when out hunting with Dandy Dinmont, told the whole story of Kennedy's murder, as he was at Warwick Point on the day of its occurrence. He stated that Glosson was present, and accepted a bribe to keep the matter a secret. This witness also stated that it was he that had told his aunt, Meg Merrilies, that Bertram had returned to the country, and that it was by her orders that 3 or 4 of the gypsies had mingled in the crowd when the custom-house was attacked, for the purpose of helping Bertram to escape. He also added that Meg Merrilies had often said that Harry Bertram carried the proof of his birth hung round his neck. Bertram here produced the velvet bag which had been worked by his mother, and which he said he had always continued to wear. On its being opened, Colonel Mannering instantly recognized his own writing on the paper it enclosed, proving to everyone's satisfaction that the wearer was the real heir of Ellangowan. The investigation was concluded by both Hatteraick and Glosson being sent to jail. The smuggler, whose violence and strength were well known, was secured in what was called the condemned ward. In this apartment, which was near the top of the prison, his feet were chained to an iron bar, firmly fixed at the height of about 6 inches from the floor. The chain enabled him to move a distance of about 4 feet from the bar, and when thus secured, his handcuffs were removed. Glosson was confined in another room, his mind still teeming with schemes of future deceit to cover his former villainies. As he reflected on his position, he came to a determination to see Hatteraick, if possible, and to induce him, by a tempting bribe, to give evidence in his favour when his trial came on. Accordingly, when MacGuffog, the keeper, appeared at night time, he gave him some gold pieces, and so obtained his consent to an interview with his fellow prisoner. The keeper, however, told him that as the prison rules were now much stricter than before, his seeing Hatteraick would only be on the condition that he should spend the whole night with him. As the prison clock tolled 10, Glosson slipped off his shoes and silently followed MacGuffog to the smuggler's room. As he entered, the door was locked on the outside, and he found himself alone with the former partner of his guilt. The cell was so dark that it was some time before he could detect the form of the smuggler, who was lying on a pallet bed beside the bar. "Derek Hatteraick," he whispered, and the smuggler, recognizing his voice, told him with a curse to be gone. "Speak to me no more, I'm dangerous." "Then," said Glosson, losing his temper, "at least get up for an obstinate Dutch brute." But he had barely uttered the words when Hatteraick sprang from where he lay and grappled with him. So sudden and irresistible was the attack that Glosson fell, the back part of his neck coming full upon the iron bar with stunning violence. Nor did the ruffian release the deadly grip upon his throat until the last remnant of life had left his victim's miserable corpse. On the day following the death of Glosson, Derek Hatteraick was himself found dead in the cell, having hanged himself by means of a cord taken from his bed, which he had cunningly contrived to attach to the prison wall. Little more remains to be told. Bertram was before long restored to the possession of his father's house and property, and Julia Mannering became his wife. His sister Lucy found a husband in her old lover, Charles Hazelwood, and the dominie was raised once again to a condition of ecstatic happiness, seeing his little Harry, as he still continued to call him, now Laird of Ellangowan, and himself librarian in the house to which he had been so long a stranger.